As we draw nearer to Holy Week and the culmination of the season of Lent, we are mindful of where we came from and aware of where this journey next takes us. Last week, Maureen, our children's director, presented to us a fantastic sermon on a very difficult text where Jesus walks into the temple in Jerusalem and calls out exploitative behaviors that the religious elite were allowing to happen there. That moment occurs in different forms throughout the Gospels, and in that moment, Jesus reveals what he is truly about: a faith that is rooted in compassion and reverent justice for human dignity. This moment in the temple is also regarded as a turning point in Jesus' ministry. His words of destroying the temple and raising it again are taken very literally and taken as a direct threat. I'd imagine if Jesus were to walk into a house of worship today and say the same things, we might call the police on him for making such threats. The religious leaders in Jerusalem certainly saw it this way, and it was in this moment that the plot to silence Jesus began. Now, in the coming weeks, we will revisit the suffering that Jesus endured because of his subversive ministry. We've already discussed the Christ-conscious mindset this Lent that understands that discipleship does not escape suffering or avoid it, but finds joy in its midst and remains steadfast. That mindset of pressing towards joy during times where joy feels distant is a central theme in the writings of the prophet Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah is speaking to the suffering people of Judah, who have lost all of their religious institutions, their temple, their monarchy, to imperial occupation of the Babylonian Empire. Their lives were completely and utterly upended by their time under imperial rule, and the traumatic losses that they experienced during that period were felt for centuries after. In the face of all of this uncertainty, fear, and desire to return to what was, Jeremiah proclaims the emergence of new possibilities within this idea of a new covenant with God. Jeremiah's words in our passage today echo the prophet Isaiah, who says, "Do not remember the former things or consider things of old. I am about to do a new thing, and now it springs forth." This newness that is spoken about by God through Isaiah is captured in the idea of the new covenant that Jeremiah illustrates. Now, as Maureen spoke about last week, Jeremiah is using this opportunity to urge his listeners to make way for a new way of being in relationship with God, to make room in their hearts and their souls for a new relationship with God. And in this case, that relationship is not rooted in a specific place like a temple or a ritual practice, but rather this new covenant, this new relationship is a relationship that is rooted within each and every one of us. Jeremiah says that this new covenant won't be like the covenant that God made with their ancestors when God took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. God will put God's instructions within them and engrave them on their hearts. They will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. Now, regardless of social standing, the covenant will reside within the hearts, within the soul of each individual. By doing this, the Judeans' participation in this covenant is no longer based in rituals or outward expressions or traditions, but solely based in a transformed individual conscience. It's not to say that those traditions or those rituals are not important, but what it is saying is that the true mark of discipleship and their relationship to God is through a transformed consciousness that inspires new rituals and new ways of being in relationship with God in our everyday lives. As Christian readers, we read this Hebrew text with Jesus in mind. We associate the new covenant with Jesus' ministry of radical transformation, and in particular with our ritual of Holy Communion. We break bread that represents Jesus' broken body and drink wine, or grape juice in our case, that represents Jesus' blood. These bodily symbols are a link to the human suffering that Jesus endured because of his commitment to his mission. And the story of clearing the temple, which Maureen preached on last week, echoes this message of transformed consciousness. Jesus' message in that moment was that the covenant and our relationship with God originates from within. And this message differed greatly from the high priests of his day, who taught a version that was very much so temple-oriented. It was a temple-oriented religion. Now, you can imagine that Jesus' metaphorical message of destroying the temple would hit that group pretty harshly if their life's meaning and their mission and their work was centered in that temple that he was claiming to destroy. But Jesus' ministry was all about reform. Like Jeremiah, Jesus is seeking reorientation for his followers toward something new, something different. It's his job as a prophet to transform the world around him. Now, Hebrews 5 talks about Jesus' calling and how he was uniquely chosen, like other high priests were. Now, the original intent for high priests was for them to be someone who was honored through their own humility and selflessness. The high priests of Jesus' time were a far cry from humble or selfless, and they reveled in their social standing more often than not. But Jesus' priesthood was one that reflected the true intent of that selfless priesthood. The author of this letter to the Hebrews writes that Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest. Now, this echoes our understanding that in becoming human, Christ sets aside divine power and privilege to become one who was born into poverty, oppression, and disadvantagement. The unavoidable part of that self-disadvantaging mission and action is his experience of suffering. And this is the crucial point of Jesus' ministry. He commits his life to those at a disadvantage, advocating for the underprivileged and offering them help and healing wherever and whenever possible. And in doing so, he endures varying degrees of suffering. Jesus doesn't have a home. He gave up a normal life, and he went about relying on the hospitality of the communities that he traveled to in order to survive. Now, throughout all the challenges that are brought by this lifestyle, Jesus remained persistent. Throughout the frustration that he came across when his disciples didn't listen, Jesus remained committed. And even in the face of death on a cross, Jesus remained steadfast to his calling as a servant to the underserved and exploited, as a servant, a priest who was serving in humility and selflessness. It is in this suffering that the author of Hebrews says Jesus is made perfect, saying, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. So, how does this relate to the new covenant that we're reflecting on? Now, Jeremiah establishes that our contribution in this new covenant is to come to a place of spiritual transformation within that inspires compassion and justice in all aspects of our lives. And when we participate in communion, we partake in the body and blood of Christ, who sacrificed his life for us. And in that partaking, we are renewed, we are reinvigorated, and we symbolically recommit ourselves to pursuing the same steadfast commitment to selflessness like Christ. As the end of Lent draws nearer, we come one step closer to the cross. We can find hope in the fact that Jesus suffers on behalf of all those who sin. The sins of the community and the unwillingness to turn from them is what led to Jesus's horrific suffering. But despite how unfair that was to him, Jesus was steadfast in his love and commitment to his mission, knowing that the suffering and ultimately the death that he would experience are not the end. In Jesus' example and in this new covenant, we are taught that a life in humble service to others has moments where suffering is inevitable. In a faith that calls us to serve selflessly, we will find ourselves giving more than we can expect to receive. As the world shifts around us, the covenant reminds us that suffering is a part of life and that joy can be found in the places where it seems least apparent. It teaches us that suffering cannot be escaped by going backwards, but can be outlasted through the fixing of our eyes on what lies ahead, and the hope and the joy that the new things that God will be doing will bring to the world. Amen.